The city awoke to another frigid winter morning, the sun barely nudging its way through the heavy grey clouds that hung low in the sky. On a narrow street lined with dilapidated buildings whose windows were patched up with cardboard and tape, a small figure stirred amongst piles of tattered blankets. Emmy, a 9-year-old girl with nothing but the thin fabric of an oversized coat to shield her from the biting cold, woke up, shivering. Her small, frail body curled tightly on a piece of worn-out cardboard that served as her bed. As she opened her eyes, the harsh reality of her life greeted her. The cold, unforgiving concrete was her home, and hunger was her constant companion. Emmy's shoes, several sizes too large and patched with fraying laces, peeked out from under the blanket. They were a stark reminder of her vulnerability and the direness of her situation. Her coat, a tattered and color-faded piece that had seen better winters, barely served its purpose. Emmy sat up slowly, her movements stiff from the cold. Her tiny hands emerged from the sleeves of her oversized coat, rubbing at her eyes before brushing off the light dusting of snow that had settled on her during the night. The air was piercingly cold, and each breath she took seemed to scratch her throat and pierce her lungs. She glanced around. The street was quiet, save for the occasional whoosh of cars passing by, their occupants oblivious to the plight of a young girl on the sidewalk. Her stomach growled loudly, a painful reminder that she had not eaten for days. With a heavy sigh, she stood up, her body weak and unsteady. She walked to the nearest trash can, her hope dwindling with each step. She rummaged through the contents, her small hands moving aside empty cans and soiled papers, searching for anything that might be edible. But, as had become the norm, she found nothing. Disheartened, Emmy wrapped her coat tighter around herself and started walking aimlessly down the street. Her mind wandered back to the days when she had a home, when her parents were still alive. Those memories seemed like distant dreams now, fragmented and blurred by the harshness of street life. Her parents had died in an accident when she was just 5, leaving her in the care of an aunt who treated her more like a burden than family. A year ago, unable to endure the constant mistreatment, Emmy had fled. The streets had become her refuge and her prison. As she walked, her eyes stung with unshed tears, a mix of exhaustion and despair clouding her vision. Then, as if a cruel joke was played on her by fate, a delicious aroma wafted through the air, reaching her nostrils and igniting a spark of hope in her hungry heart. It was the smell of warm food, rich and inviting. Emmy looked up and noticed she was standing in front of an elegant restaurant. The door was slightly ajar, emitting the heavenly scent of roasted meat and freshly baked bread. She stood there for a moment, transfixed by the sight inside. Through the window she could see people sitting at tables covered with white linen, their plates filled with food, laughing and talking in their warm, comfortable clothes. It was a scene from a different world, one where hunger and cold were mere stories, not harsh realities. Emmy's stomach growled again, louder this time. She knew she didn't belong in that world. Her appearance, a grimy face, tangled hair, and clothes several sizes too big and dirt-stained, would surely get her thrown out before she could even plead her case. But desperation drove her forward. She mustered all her courage, pulled the restaurant door open, and stepped inside. The warmth of the restaurant enveloped her immediately, a stark contrast to the cold outside. The chandeliers overhead sparkled brilliantly, reflecting off the polished silverware and glassware that adorned the tables. The murmurs of the well-dressed patrons filled the air, a melody of contentment and ease. Emmy hesitated just inside the doorway, her eyes wide with both fear and wonder. She felt every gaze that turned her way, heard the shift in conversation as people noticed her disheveled appearance. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, her heart pounding in her chest. Emmy's hesitant steps carried her into the warm embrace of the restaurant, her eyes darting nervously around the opulent room as she inched forward. The clink of cutlery and the murmur of conversation filled the air, punctuated by soft laughter from the well-dressed patrons. Each table was an island of joy, far removed from the harsh reality Emmy faced every day. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she approached a table where a family was indulging in a feast that to her seemed fit for royalty. "Excuse me?" Emmy whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and desperation. Her stomach churned with hunger as she inhaled the tantalizing aromas of roasted meats and fresh bread. "Could I please have some food?" Her eyes were wide, pleading as she clutched her threadbare coat tighter around her small frame. The restaurant fell silent for a moment, the atmosphere shifting as patrons turned to stare. Whispers filled the air, laced with disdain and shock. "Why is there a street child in here?" someone muttered under their breath. A well-dressed man at a nearby table scowled, his lip curling in disgust. At the edge of the room, a child, no older than Emmy, looked up from his plate, his eyes meeting hers with a flicker of understanding and concern. He tugged at his mother's sleeve, whispering, "Mommy, can't we give her something to eat?" But the mother quickly shushed him, her eyes darting around nervously as if afraid of being overheard, showing compassion. Nearby, an elderly woman watched the scene unfold with a furrowed brow, her expression one of conflicted emotions. She made a slight move as if to stand, her hand pausing mid-air, but the stern look from her companion halted her actions. The pressure of the public eye, the unspoken rule of decorum in such an establishment, anchored her back into her seat. The waiter, a tall man in a crisp uniform, approached Emmy with quick, decisive steps. His face was set in a firm line as he reached her side. "This isn't a place for begging. You need to leave," he stated coldly, his voice low but firm. Emmy's eyes filled with tears, her lips parting as she tried to muster the courage to speak again. "Please, sir, I haven't eaten in days. Just some bread, anything." Before she could finish, the waiter grasped her arm, his grip tight but careful not to hurt her. "You must go now," he insisted, pulling her gently but inexorably towards the door. The eyes of the entire restaurant followed them, a mix of relief and further disdain painting the faces of the affluent diners as they witnessed her removal. As they reached the door, a harsh voice rang out from the table she had approached. "Make sure she doesn't come back. We can't have beggars disturbing our meals," a man declared, his voice dripping with contempt. Pushed gently but firmly out of the door, Emmy stumbled onto the cold pavement outside, the warmth of the restaurant giving way to the biting winter air. The door closed with a soft thud behind her, sealing off the light and heat, and leaving her in the shadowy, cold world she knew all too well. She stood there, a solitary figure, her breath misting in the air as she fought back sobs. The sting of rejection and the gnawing hunger pained her far more than the cold she was accustomed to. As the laughter and chatter resumed behind the closed doors, Emmy's sense of isolation deepened. The brief warmth she had felt inside the restaurant now seemed like a cruel tease of what life could offer, but had chosen to withhold from her. With nowhere to go and no one to turn to, she wrapped her arms around herself, the weight of her loneliness and despair heavier than ever. She looked back at the restaurant, its windows glowing warmly in the twilight, a world apart from the cold, harsh pavement where she stood, rejected and forgotten. Emmy sat huddled against the cold stone wall of the restaurant, her thin jacket barely insulating her against the biting wind that swept through the narrow city streets. The warmth of the restaurant was now just a memory, as distant and unreachable as a star in the night sky. She pressed her face against the cold glass of the restaurant window, watching the blurry figures of diners inside. In their laughter and merriment, she saw a reflection not of herself, but of another unfortunate soul, one who belonged to the streets. Her eyes, rimmed with tears that threatened to spill, caught sight of her own reflection in the glass, a ghostly image of a young girl lost and forgotten. The cruel irony of her situation wasn't lost on her. Here she was, on the outside looking in, as if she were watching the life she could never have. The stark divide between her world and theirs was reinforced by the glass barrier that separated her from the warmth and care she so desperately needed. As she shifted slightly to tuck her legs closer, trying to conserve whatever warmth she could, a rustling sound from a nearby alley caught her attention. Turning her head, she saw a stray dog, its fur matted and dirty, dragging something out of a trash can. Her stomach churned as she recognized it, a fish likely discarded from the same restaurant that had just expelled her. It was half-eaten, rotting, but to her hungry eyes, it was a feast. The dog tugged at the fish, pulling it free from a tangle of trash. Emmy's first impulse was to rush over, to claim the meager meal for herself. The animal instincts that hunger had sharpened over time screamed at her to fight for the food. She could almost taste the fish, could imagine the relief that even a few bites might bring to her aching belly. But as she stood, a wave of humanity washed over her. The sight of the struggling dog, as desperate and hungry as she was, made her pause. Her heart, still tender despite the hardships it had endured, couldn't bear the thought of taking what little this creature had managed to find. "No," she whispered to herself, a faint voice in the cold. "I can't. I just can't." She watched as the dog finally freed the fish and started to eat. Emmy's heart ached with a mixture of hunger and compassion. She spoke softly to the animal from a safe distance, her voice trembling. "Enjoy it, little friend. You need it just as much as I do." As she spoke, her breath visible in the cold air, she realized how much she had retained her humanity despite everything. She had nothing, owned nothing, was nothing in the eyes of so many. But she had her compassion, her ability to feel for another living being. And, perhaps, she considered, that was worth more than a meal. With a heavy sigh, Emmy wrapped her arms tighter around herself and looked back through the window of the restaurant. The diners continued their meals, oblivious to the drama that had just unfolded mere yards from their comfortable perch. Emmy felt more isolated than ever, but there was a new, albeit small, sense of pride warming her chest, a warmth that came not from food or shelter, but from the dignity of her own choices. She settled back against the wall, resigned to her hunger, but resolved to maintain her integrity, no matter how hard her circumstances tried to strip it away. The door of the luxurious restaurant shut softly behind Emmy, the click of its closing marking the severance of two worlds. Inside, the warmth lingered in the air, along with the scent of expensive cuisine and the soft tinkle of laughter and conversation. Mr. Carter Baizen, the owner of the establishment, had been in the back managing inventory when the commotion stirred by Emmy's presence reached his ears. Curious about the unusual disruption, he made his way to the front, his eyes immediately finding the small, disheveled figure now retreating from his restaurant's polished glass door. As Emmy huddled against the cold, Mr. Baizen watched her through the window, his expression pensive. She pulled her thin coat tightly around her, a stark contrast to the warmth and opulence that radiated from within the establishment. Baizen's heart clenched at the sight, a rush of unexpected emotion surging through him. There was something about her, a familiarity that resonated deep within his chest, a stirring of long-buried memories. Turning away from the window, Mr. Baizen walked back to his private office, his mind racing. The staff, noticing his sudden retreat and somber expression, exchanged curious glances but said nothing. Once inside his office, Mr. Baizen sat heavily behind his mahogany desk, the leather chair creaking under his weight. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk and burying his face in his hands. The image of Emmy, so small and desperate, had ignited a spark of remembrance that he could no longer ignore. He thought back to his own childhood, harsh and marked by poverty. Mr. Baizen had grown up in a small, decrepit apartment that was always too cold in the winter and too hot in the summer, much like the streets Emmy now called home. His parents had worked tirelessly, yet they barely scraped by, and there were nights, too many to count, when he had gone to bed with an empty stomach. The gnawing pain of hunger had been his constant companion, just as it was now for Emmy. No one in his current life knew of these humble beginnings. He had built his empire on the remnants of a past he preferred to forget, but seeing Emmy had brought it all rushing back. The hunger, the cold, the despair. It was all too familiar. And now he was in a position to do something about it. Mr. Baizen lifted his head, his decision made. He couldn't undo his past, but he could certainly shape someone else's future. He rose from his chair and strode out of his office with renewed purpose. Quickly making his way through the dining area, he approached the front door. He stepped outside, scanning the street for any sign of Emmy. Spotting her curled up on the sidewalk, he walked over, his approach cautious. "Hello there," he started gently, not wanting to frighten her. Emmy looked up, her eyes wide with surprise and a flicker of fear. She tried to shuffle away, but her body was too weak, her movements sluggish. "Please, don't be afraid. I'm not here to hurt you," Mr. Baizen continued, his voice low and soothing. "I saw you from inside and, well, it seems like you could use a helping hand." Emmy, still wary, watched him with uncertainty. "Why would you want to help me?" Her voice was barely a whisper, her disbelief palpable. Mr. Baizen crouched down to her level, meeting her gaze steadily. "Because I once was where you are now. I know what it's like to be hungry, to be cold. I made a promise to myself a long time ago that if I could ever help someone else in that situation, I would." His voice was earnest, imbued with a warmth that reached out to her. Emmy blinked back tears, the kindness of his words piercing the armor she had built around her heart. Here was this man, the owner of such a grand restaurant, revealing a shard of his past that mirrored her present struggles. "Can you stand?" Mr. Baizen asked, offering his hand. Hesitantly, Emmy placed her small, cold hand in his. With gentle strength, he helped her to her feet, supporting her as she stumbled slightly. "Let's get you somewhere warm, somewhere safe," he said, guiding her back towards the restaurant. As they walked, Mr. Baizen felt a profound sense of purpose settle within him. This was more than a good deed, it was a second chance. Not just for Emmy, but perhaps for himself as well, to mend a piece of his past by reshaping her future. Back inside the restaurant, away from the prying eyes and cold judgments, Mr. Baizen led Emmy through to the kitchen, bypassing the curious stares of his staff. He knew this was just the beginning of a new chapter, one that would likely raise eyebrows among his clientele. But as he looked down at Emmy, her small hand clutching his, he knew without a doubt that it was the right thing to do. This was his turning point, and now it was hers too. Mr. Baizen guided Emmy through the warmly lit corridors of his restaurant, the soft hum of the kitchen appliances and the distant clatter of dishes creating a comforting backdrop. The stark contrast to the cold, harsh streets made Emmy's eyes widen in quiet awe as they entered the expansive kitchen where the scents of baking bread and simmering sauces filled the air. Mr. Baizen motioned to a quiet corner where a small table was set up away from the bustling activity of the kitchen staff. "Sit here, Emmy. I'll get you something to eat," he said, his voice carrying a soothing, paternal tone. Emmy watched as Mr. Baizen personally prepared a plate for her, piling it high with warm, nourishing food. He brought it over with a gentle smile, placing it before her, along with a glass of water. "Eat as much as you need," he encouraged. The food was simple but delicious, far beyond anything Emmy had tasted in her recent memory. She ate tentatively at first, overwhelmed by the flavors and the kindness that had suddenly filled her world. But soon, hunger won over, and she ate with a fervor driven by days of deprivation. Mr. Baizen watched her with a mix of satisfaction and concern, remembering his own days of hunger. Once Emmy had finished eating, Mr. Baizen spoke softly. "Now, let's get you somewhere more comfortable." He led her outside, into a sleek car waiting by the curb. The short drive to his mansion was made in comfortable silence, with Emmy gazing out the window, taking in the sights of a part of the city she had never seen. Arriving at his home, Mr. Baizen ushered Emmy inside, the grandeur of the mansion unfolding before her. Her eyes were wide with wonder, her mind barely grasping the shift in her fortunes. He took her to a large bathroom, where a bathtub was already filled with warm water and bubbles. "This is all for you, Emmy. Take your time," Mr. Baizen said, showing her how to use the different bath products arranged on the side. Emmy approached the bathtub hesitantly. She touched the bubbles curiously, then her fingers met the warm water. A smile broke over her face, the first genuine smile in a long time, as she realized she could relax, that she was safe. Slowly, she undressed and eased herself into the tub, the warmth enveloping her sore, tired muscles. It was a simple luxury, but to Emmy, it felt like a new beginning. After her bath, Mr. Baizen presented her with a soft, fluffy towel and led her to a bedroom that would be hers. The room was beautifully decorated, with a large, comfortable bed and windows that looked out over the garden. "For your first night," Mr. Baizen said, handing her a soft teddy bear. "Just in case you need someone to hold." Emmy clutched the teddy bear tightly, her eyes moist with unspoken gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Baizen," she murmured, feeling overwhelmed by his generosity. "It's Carter. Please." "And you're welcome, Emmy. You're safe here," he reassured her, his voice gentle. That night, Emmy climbed into bed, the softest she had ever felt, holding the teddy bear close. The quietness of the room was a stark contrast to the noisy, harsh streets she was used to. She whispered a quiet prayer of thanks for Mr. Baizen before drifting off to a peaceful sleep. Several weeks had passed since Emmy first crossed the threshold of Carter Baizen's mansion, a period during which the empty spaces in her heart began to fill with the warmth of a newfound family. Emmy, once a timid and wary street child, had transformed into a curious and joyful young girl. Her laughter now a common melody that resonated throughout the grand halls of the mansion. One bright and breezy afternoon, Carter's children, Paulo and Marie, decided it was time for another step in Emmy's integration into their world, learning to ride a bicycle. This activity, so mundane yet joyous, was symbolic of Emmy's ongoing journey, balancing the challenges of the new and the thrill of achievement. In the spacious courtyard, Paolo adjusted the seat of a small blue bicycle, ensuring it was just the right height for Emmy. "You ready to give it a try?" he asked with an encouraging smile. Emmy nodded, her heart thumping with excitement mixed with a touch of nervousness. Marie stood beside her, ready to support her. "Don't worry, Emmy," she reassured. "We'll be right here with you. You're going to love it." With one sibling on either side, Emmy took her first tentative pedal strokes. The initial wobbles made her gasp, but Paolo's steady hand on her shoulder kept her upright. "That's it. You're doing great, Emmy," he cheered. After several rounds of the courtyard, with the wind catching her hair and laughter bubbling from her lips, Emmy began to pedal on her own. The freedom of gliding along, powered by her own two legs, was exhilarating. It was more than just riding a bike. It was a metaphor for her new life, moving forward, maintaining balance and finding freedom in the security of her new family. One particularly sunny morning, Emmy awoke in her soft, large bed, surrounded by plush pillows and the comfort of her beloved teddy bear. She stretched, her arms reaching towards the ornate ceiling. Her mind still marveled at the fairy tale turn her life had taken. Today was special. Carter had told her it was her birthday, a concept previously overshadowed by her struggle for survival. For the first time, she would celebrate the day with a party, complete with a cake that boasted the correct number of candles to mark her 9 years. Carter watched from the doorway, his heart swelling with pride. "Good morning, Emmy," he greeted, his voice warm with affection. "Are you ready to be the birthday princess?" Emmy's face lit up, her smile reaching her bright, eager eyes. "Yes, Carter. Do you think anyone will come to my party?" Her voice trembled slightly with a mix of excitement and nervous anticipation. "Of course they will," Carter reassured her as he walked into the room. "Everyone is excited to celebrate with you, and there's a special surprise waiting for you downstairs." Her curiosity piqued. Emmy quickly dressed in a beautiful dress Carter had gifted her, its fabric soft and colored in her favorite shade of sky blue. Hand in hand, they descended the staircase to the sounds of cheerful greetings from the household staff and a few close friends Carter had invited. The living room had been transformed into a festive haven, adorned with balloons and streamers, the air filled with the delicious aroma of baking vanilla and chocolate. As they entered, everyone cheered, "Happy birthday, Emmy!" The day was filled with games, laughter, and stories. Emmy felt a sense of belonging she had never known, her heart full, her spirits high. As the cake was brought out, lit with 9 glowing candles, Carter leaned down and whispered, "Make a wish, Emmy." Emmy closed her eyes, her mind not wishing for toys or gifts, but rather silently thanking fate for bringing her to this new family. She blew out the candles, the applause of her new friends and family echoing warmly around her. Later, as the party wound down, Carter took Emmy aside. "How do you feel?" he asked, looking into her eyes, searching for any sign of the sadness that used to cloud them. "I feel happy. Really happy," Emmy replied, her voice sincere and mature beyond her years. "Carter, can I call you Dad from now on?" Carter's eyes moistened with unexpected tears, and he nodded, pulling her into a tight embrace. "Yes, Emmy, I'd like that very much." That evening, as Emmy lay in her bed, the day's joys replaying in her mind, she realized that this birthday marked more than her age. It celebrated the new life she had found. No longer was she Emmy, the forgotten child of the streets. She was Emmy Baizen, beloved daughter, cherished friend, and a testament to the transformative power of kindness. In the quiet of her room, with the moon casting a gentle glow through the window, Emmy held her teddy bear close. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered into the quiet room, her voice filled with love and gratitude.